Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and today I will be interviewing Kristin Hodson. She's a co-founder of the soon-to-launch website Sex Made Simple. She's founder and executive director of the Healing Group Mental Health Clinic in Salt Lake City, and co-author of the book called Real Intimacy, A Couple's Guide for Genuine Healthy Sexuality. She has spent over 3 years exclusively studying human sexuality and has become a certified sex therapist, which is pretty much how we met Kristin, is through that whole ASECT process of becoming sex therapists. And she has been an expert speaker in national trainings led by sex therapists. Dr. Gina Ogden and Tammy Nelson has contributed to SheKnows.com, Women's Day magazine, the Deseret News, was a regular guest on a local radio show taking live calls on sex and intimacy, and has regularly appeared on KSL's Studio 5 on KUTV 2 News. So welcome, Kristin, to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. I have so much appreciate working with you over the last few years, and we've always had some really great conversations around a lot of topics that interplay with Mormonism and sexuality, so just very honored to have you.
Yeah, this should be I'm really looking forward to this episode.
So today we are going to tackle a pretty interesting and controversial and very applicable topic, and that is pornography and often what is called porn addiction. And so that's where we're going to start. And I guess we'll start a little bit with just kind of I want you to introduce yourself further if you feel the need to do that, but also kind of give your ideas as to why this is such a prevalent topic that is just kind of all around us, whether in Mormonism or just in the general media. And I think it's a discussion that's happening in many circles.
Yeah, so let me just for the sake of Studio 5's on KSL. So that's the first thing I'm going to do is that. Secondly, this is a topic that I'm deeply passionate about, and I think a lot of people, like you say, it's in a lot of circles, people are deeply passionate about, that the conversations are happening in a variety of circles, and even on the professional level, it's very controversial. And so I want to put this out there that a lot of people sit on various ends of how they think about the issue of sex and porn addiction, and that my goal today with this podcast with you is to help people potentially look at this differently or think about it differently, but understanding that a lot of people have personal experiences with this, and so it can really it can get personal really quick and bring up a lot of emotions for people. So I just want to put that into the mix, that the goal today, whether you leave this totally agreeing with everything we said, is to just take what's relevant and helpful, and or if your starting point is just to look at it at a slightly different way, that's great.
Yeah, that's a really good intro, because I agree there's so many different experiences around this topic, and whether you're the person who has been involved in pornography viewing, or the spouse of such a person, or family member, or whatever, it's just it comes with a lot of emotional charge, and it comes with a lot of messages that we've integrated over a long period of time. So that this podcast is not meant to blame any one person or call any one person out. It's more about looking at the whole systemic nature of why we find ourselves in this position to begin with. And if we're going to blame anything, we can blame systems that have failed us, right? As far as sexual education systems, or figuring out how to deal with these things in ways differently than we have. So
they're very complex. Yeah. So if it's okay, I kind of want to start off with just sharing an experience of, because my growth as a professional on this started early on, because I've seen clients that have come to me for porn or sex and sex addiction before I even started pursuing certification to become a sex therapist. And it was very easy for me. There was a model already there. It was really, really accessible. And so it made sense for me to help give these people a diagnosis, what's happening, course of treatment, outcome, and that felt safe to me as a clinician, and that felt safe to clients. You're like, okay, there's a name for this, there's hope, there's treatment, there's good outcomes. And so that's all I knew, and that's what I would dare say most people know. And so I want to talk about a client that started to kind of shape my thinking differently, because I think it's very relatable. So I had a client that they came to me as a couple because she had recently discovered her husband's pornography use, and it was more extensive than she had thought. Not what she had deemed was worst case scenario, but one of her biggest fears going into marriage is that suddenly she would have a spouse that was addicted to pornography. So when she discovered the pornography, all of those fears came up, and naturally I made the referral for them to go have a more extensive treatment and put them into a sex addiction treatment center. And they went through the program together. And what they found through this is it was a really interesting process, because once they went through it, yes, they had the diagnosis, they were looking at all of these things. But she was also, there wasn't a space, if she were the one struggling with pornography, there wasn't a space. It was always the females that needed support, and the men were the ones looking at pornography. So that was really of interest. And then this went on for about 9 months. And what ended up happening is, as the husband was continuing to go through his treatment in his group, he got additional ideas. And because relapse was a part of it, he ended up acting out in a much bigger way. And it ended up not being helpful. And she finally looked at him and said, I don't think you're a sex addict, so what's going on? And he looked at her and said, I don't think I'm an addict either. And they decided to leave the sex addiction treatment. They came back, we regrouped, and we started looking at it differently. And what we discovered was a lot of undiagnosed anxiety, a lot of untreated. It was diagnosed, they knew that there was trauma, but it was very much untreated. And we started to discover a lot of other issues. And as they started to explore those, the course of everything changed. And so that, I put that out there, that I think a lot of people can relate to a situation like that. And that was kind of the shift for me of getting really curious about this. And so at that point, as a clinician, I got 2 books out, The Myth of Sex Addiction and one by Patrick Carnes, and read both of those and tried to have a conversation with those authors for me. And it helped me start to look at this differently. And so I kind of want to start there as a starting point for this discussion, which then may lend us to move right into that it's actually not a diagnosis. It's not in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the current edition, and it's never been in previous editions. So what does that mean? What does that mean? What are the clinical implications that this is a somewhat of a pseudo-diagnosis, and it's a criteria that's not agreed by the psychiatric community, the psychological community at all? What does that mean? So
So let's talk a little bit about the history. I mean, I know you and I were both at the last ASECT conference last summer, and both of us attended probably about, I'm thinking about 10 different presentations on this exact topic, because we find it so important to the culture that we work with, and wanting to understand it really at the best levels possible. So let's talk a little bit about the history about the sex addiction model. And you mentioned Carnes, Patrick Carnes,
Yep.
who is really kind of the father of the sex addiction model with some of
Right.
the books and programs that he's come out with. And to help people understand too that this is not a model that came from research, it's more that he was finding people with out of control sexual behavior, what he deemed that term to be, and was trying to help them as a clinician. This was, probably 40 years ago that this
Sure.
started. And there really weren't other models around or even other people necessarily discussing this. So this is one person who kind of came up with his own model, which happens a lot in the psychology field,
Yeah.
and then started becoming successful with it. Whereas other diagnoses, oftentimes the diagnosis comes first and the research has been done, and then clinicians come up with models to deal with that diagnosis. So this was a little bit like the horse came in front of the cart, or the cart came in front of the horse, however that saying goes.
Well, and let's put even that in a further context, because in our country, we have an abstinence only approach to sexuality. So there's this drought. People aren't having a good baseline of healthy sexuality and understanding of what that is. And so I can empathize a bit of here's Patrick Carnes having all these people come into him that are in distress. Couples are in distress, people are in distress, and going, how do I help them? And looking at it as problematic sexual behavior, but not necessarily examining the correlation. And this is what I can hypothesize, but the correlation of we have a huge hole around healthy sexuality in general. But this kind of kicked off the stage of that there's unhealthy sexuality or pathological sexuality, but not really helping people empower them of having even a baseline of basic sexual health and understanding. So I think the history is important, and I think it's really important that just for consumers to know that then further with Patrick Carnes, he developed what's known as the CSAT certification. And so that's a certified sex addiction therapist. And that certification has come from him, but it's not coming from another governing board. And so I think that's important that a lot of this has been grandfathered by him.
Right. So for those who are not professionals, like for example, when we work towards licensure in any given state, there's a huge group of people who have decided what it's going to take to become licensed as a as a mental health professional. Whether you're a marriage and family therapist or a psychologist or a professional counselor. I mean, there's several different fields within the mental health profession, and there's these governing boards where research and committees and many people have gone together to decide what these qualifications will look like. And that's true even of like the sex therapy accreditation that you and I have worked towards, right? That's not just a one person
Right.
accreditation. And so so that's a very different thing than having one person decide, this is a type of therapy that I've developed and that I found success in, and therefore I'm going to train other clinicians to become, I guess, certified in the type of therapy that I do. And that's more of a personal approach. And there's many people who do this. John Gottman, for example, he has a certification
Right.
process. Michael Yapko has a certification process for hypnosis.
Right.
So there's lots of people who come up with these things, but that's more of a, I'm a seasoned professional. I have found this useful. Other therapists think that I have something to offer, and so I'm going to, train them in my particular way of doing things. And that's where this sex addiction certification has come from. It's not governed by a larger board.
Right. So let's go back to the diagnosis, because I think this is important. It continues to be curious to me, and I think a lot of people in the community, as to why it's not in there. And the term that used to be called, or still is called, is hypersexuality disorder. That's what the proposal was, to get that into the diagnostic criteria, or the DSM, but it's not in there. And so if you were to Google search, am I a sex addict? There's going to be a criteria for you to answer different questions. And I'm just going to give you, I'm going to admit right now, I'm cherry picking on a few of these just because it's long. But
these are self questionnaires, right, that people
yeah,
take
this is a
online.
self-test. I couldn't find, I did try to dig deeper and find like a diagnostic criteria if I were a CST or a CSAT, but I'm not a CSAT, so I need to put that in there. So I'm sure there's more of a criteria, but this is what I could find. One of the questions, have you ever had certain kinds of sex or had sex with certain people that later disgusted you and you thought back on it? I think that's a very relative question. And I think majority of people could answer that of, yeah, even kissing someone that I wasn't interested in. And I look back and I'm like, ugh, I regret that. To engaging in some sort of sexual act or behavior that they regret. I think that's very relative to look at that. When you have sex, do you feel depressed afterwards or later regret it? Again, I have worked with so many people that they do feel depressed. They cry. They feel really sad. They feel dirty. And it's not related to sex addiction. Let's see. Do you ever feel preoccupied or distracted by your sexual thoughts or activity? I think that's very relative. And this one is really interesting to me. Did your parents have ongoing sexual or romantic problems? I think majority of people could. And again, relative. Who gets to determine that? And so they have more extreme cases of, do you spend a lot of time looking for prostitutes or webcams or different things like that? But again, you put these into context of people's lives and you look at what's going on. And this is not to say that sex should just be a free for all and anything goes. But I think that not having any kind of criteria, some of the other criteria that I do remember is, when you look at pornography, have you tried to stop and you can't? Again, I have people that come in and they'll identify as a sex addict and they've looked at porn 4 times over the course of a year. They regret it. They feel bad about it. They think about it. And so technically they would meet criteria. Or a person that's looking at it once a day. And the questions that always come to my head is, how much sex is too much sex? What kind of sex is okay and what kind of sex is not okay?
And who gets to decide those
Who gets
things?
to decide? And Dr. David Schnartz, I love what he says, that we deem anything perverted as something that we won't do. So everything we do sexually is good. But if we get to a point where, oh, that's something I wouldn't do, then we're like, oh, that's perverted. So who gets to decide? Where does that come from? And I know religiously, and we did this research for our book, the line, again, we get asked this question a lot of what kind of sex is okay? Can I do this in the bedroom? Can we not do this in the bedroom? And the church is really pulled out of the bedroom. I realized back in the 70s and earlier, they were involved and had statements around things. But as of 2016, they're not saying what behaviors you can or can't do. It's generally anything that's not coercive, abusive, or unnatural. That's pretty, to me, that speaks of having the couple and individual figure that out for themselves.
Yeah, and even some of those terms can get problematic because to your point, what might seem unnatural to me,
Yes.
might not seem unnatural to somebody else, when you start looking at how you're going to define those terms. And to your point, if I'm not comfortable with it, then it must be unnatural versus...
Well, isn't sticking my tongue in my spouse's ear, it's not a natural place for a tongue to go. So it can be it's so relative.
Right.
And so I like to have people have to grapple with their own sexuality and to have space for that. But the criteria, as far as I can see up to this point, is very vague, very relative. I would also like to add is that most clinicians are graduating and they haven't had even one course in human sexuality. So potentially, if you're not you could be sitting in front of someone that they're pulling from other models, they're pulling from their own experience, they're pulling from a variety of places to determine healthy, not healthy, and passing that on because they've never had training around it, but they're having clients sit in front of them that need help. And unfortunately, I see that a lot as well. So this model has really filled in. If there's a space to be filled, the space has been filled in, and that's the most accessible model, the place where there's the greatest amount of explanation. And so I think it's a very easy place for people to begin when they're in distress. And when you're in crisis, you're looking for help. So it makes sense to me at this point, especially if we look even religiously, this is the model that our church is currently using. We have a 12-step program. That's the model where we have available, and it's, for all intents and purposes, it's a very efficient model. You can treat the masses. You don't not necessarily have to do individual stuff. You can help a ton of people in self-help ways and a variety of ways. And so just putting it out there that this model filled in a space that still, even culturally, we're just barely beginning to fill in by starting to look at healthy sexuality, talk about sex, etc.
Yeah, so I want to piggyback a lot of what you're talking about with diagnosis, because as a clinician and as you're relating, many people were coming to me as well for these issues. And what I started seeing both at conferences that I was going to and how professionals were talking about these issues, and even my clients, is that it was very relative to a person's experience either with their own religious or moral code versus not. So for example, I could have a narcissistic personality disorder person in my room who was, in my biased perspective, reporting risky sexual behaviors, quite things that maybe would raise my red flags as problematic. And this person had no guilt or concern, or felt very good about their sexual behaviors.
Right.
And had really wasn't affecting their relationships in ways that at least they didn't perceive it was affecting their relationships, and it wasn't affecting their ability to lead a productive life. Which is part of that diagnostic criteria. You often look at, okay, is this even with depression or anxiety, is this affecting your quality of life? Is this affecting your relationships? It's kind of how things get diagnosed.
Right.
So I'd have that person, and then I'd have a young man, preparing for his mission, for example, who had been told not to masturbate for 6 months, and had maybe masturbated in the last 4 months once, and was extremely anxietous about this. Felt extremely bad about himself, was super scared that he wasn't going to be able to meet this criteria to be able to go on his mission, and the effects that would have on his life and his family, and his family's distraught about it, so it's affecting his relationships, it's affecting his quality of life, and he's masturbated once in 4 months, right? So that's the level of sexuality. So he looks at these diagnostic criteria and very much self-diagnoses, and quite frankly, the diagnostic criteria would diagnose him too because of the level of distress he's experiencing.
Right.
And that just started to make no sense to me at all, as far as
Right.
how we are going about this. And I think I read a current study that says about 75 to 80% of Christian men will self-report as sex addicts at this particular time in our country,
Yes.
in the United States of America. And that is flabbergasting to me, because even with addiction itself, like substance abuse addiction, the numbers are about, I believe, 8 to 10% are affected by substance abuse addiction, which is what these diagnoses are really meant to cover. So for 80% of our Christian population, male population, to be self-identifying in this way, I just think is such a harmful way to approach sexuality. Of course, spouses are very much involved in this. Women, like you kind of mentioned, women aren't even told that they could be sex addicts, right? So, which downplays their own desire and their own sexuality in ways that we could talk about later. But spouses, in a sense, are also kind of taught how to respond to these issues, right? So my spouse is an addict, therefore I must be very upset. This is very threatening to my marriage. These are very legitimate, difficult feelings to have as a spouse. It really does truly feel threatening to your marriage. And so you can see how the whole kind of domino effect of this problem gets exacerbated.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking to the research, when we were writing our book, the other thing is there was a pilot project that was down more in Utah County. And rather than saying they had the ecclesiastical leaders switch the way they were asking the questions of have you looked at porn to that being a yes or no to an assumptive of when was the last time you looked at porn, and that number went up to it was like 90%. And the problem I see with that is what are people determining as porn? Because I have people that will say I looked at a Victoria's Secret magazine and that was porn, all the way down the spectrum. And it's really high. And I think it's very problematic that there's really only one option being explored of sex addict or not. And I have found when it comes to sexuality, kind of this binary is relatively works when it comes to human sexuality. So either you're a sex addict or not doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me either.
Well, we don't have a lot of room, obviously, in our Mormon culture for any level of tolerance for porn, right? So it's not like somebody could say, well, I only look at it once a month, so it's not something I really need to worry about. There's other moral issues I can stand to work on more than that.
Sure.
We really have zero tolerance for this particular behavior at all. And so then that really creates a problem too with, just understanding human behavior. Most of us are not 100% compliant with any human behavior.
No.
I bite my nails, or I eat too many donuts, or I scream at my kids more than I should, and those are things we continually work on, but we usually don't go from, having those behaviors to not having them at all. It's a progress spectrum.
Well, and the question I'm assuming a lot of people might be asking is, but what about how the study's showing that it changes the brain? What about everything we know that the withdrawal symptoms and all of that? And I think that's an important piece to look at as well. There's a new book coming out called Truth, and it's a man's experience, and he's a celebrity of some sort, of what it was like to go through sex addiction treatment. And it was a really high-end one. And one of the first things that they did upon arrival is they took his blood pressure. And he asked about this. Why are you taking my blood pressure? When you're going through withdrawal, we want to make sure you're physically stable. I say this with somewhat not laughing because I don't know. I have also worked in substance abuse. I have seen what it's like to withdraw chemically. And when someone is addicted to prescription pain pills or alcohol, there can be big problems and they need medical monitoring. I haven't heard of a case where someone needed medical monitoring for withdrawing from sex. Maybe you have, Natasha, but no. I haven't heard any case where someone died, and what did they die of? They went cold turkey off of sex. I haven't personally seen that. Now, that's not to say that there isn't, again, if there's an underlying issue of anxiety or depression or untreated OCD, that can be really greatly distressing and uncomfortable as you take away a method of coping. I want to be clear about that. But I haven't seen anyone die or get the chills or aches in their bones, or I haven't seen that.
I would totally second that. I started my career with at a clinic where they were treating heroin addiction, and I had all kinds of physical symptoms happening right in my office, including, vomiting and chills and just incredibly physical responses to withdrawal from opiates, and that I have never seen anything like that in my office around pornography or sex issues. And I agree that there's a difference between discomfort and irritability, which is a natural part of any behavioral change. versus what you're describing right now.
Right. And I work with a lot of clients around this issue. And I had a client that came in and he was looking at pornography and masturbating once a day and had been doing this for quite a while, and it would ebb and flow. And as we started to explore healthy sexuality, what does that even mean? His own sexuality, mental health, going over his life history, putting it all into context. It was really interesting what started to happen. And he came in and he's like, it's been 4 weeks since I've looked at porn, and I don't monitor that. I don't come in and have the first thing be, tell me your porn use, tell me that I'm not looking at this exclusively as managing a behavior. But I asked, 4 weeks, wow, how did you do that? And he's like, what ended up happening is he started to value other things differently and started to look at, where do I feel healthiest sexually? Where do I feel healthy? And he just kept asking himself that question. And I pointed out and I said, you went cold turkey. What did you experience? And he's like, well, nothing. And he stopped and thought about that. And he's like, maybe I'm not an addict. Maybe there are other things going on as we're looking at them that have never been addressed or dealt with. And I to preserve his confidentiality, I'm not going to go into all of his history, but he even found it very curious as coming in and identifying as an addict and then being able to stop for 4 weeks. And that wasn't protocol for what we were doing. That was his own choice. And he didn't stop masturbating per se, but he didn't want to look at pornography anymore because he felt like that impacted his overall health. So the whole thing was very interesting. And so the other thing I want to say is the piece of changing the brain of, well, when we orgasm, we know it's the most pleasurable sensation we feel in the human experience. Our brain loves orgasm. So is that a chemical reaction? Absolutely. And so there's a lot of components to that, but the idea, when you combine that with the brain as being plastic, you have to look at the different research and combine them and put them in context, because you can have confirmation bias where you can find research that already supports the answer you're assuming. So this is, again, that big discussion of, you've got professionals and scientists that are saying it absolutely changes the brain, and others saying, well, there's a chemical reaction, but it's not permanently changing the brain. But then you can also put this into behavioral issues of the same things happening with phone use. And so I just want to put that out there. And if people are wondering, what about this, I hear that and I get it. And I wanted to briefly touch on that.
Yeah, and I think it's a legitimate point because I think, most of our behavior changes the brain over time, especially as we become habituated to certain things. And it can be difficult to stop habits that we prefer not to have, or, because I talk about the brain kind of being like a mountain with, if you start water at the top, it kind of creates these ruts, right? That then it's easy for the water to just kind of keep going in those ruts that were already created. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we don't, to your point, that it's a plastic brain, that we can't create new ruts. We can, and that's a very helpful message.
Right.
And that's different than a disease model of addiction for chemical dependence. So let's talk about that a little bit. Why would we be resistant to this sex addiction? You say there's some positives. For one, like you say, it's easily distributed. It's you can say, here's a behavior I don't want to be participating in. Now I can identify as an addict, which allows me maybe to feel a little less guilty about my choices because now it's something I can't help. I think this is oftentimes what's helpful to a spouse.
Absolutely.
Is to be able to say, it's not because my husband or wife doesn't love me or because they don't prioritize me, it's because they're sick. And so
the other
therefore,
thing, not even prioritize me. And it's not that because people, to discuss pleasure and sexual behaviors they want to do, we have not had modeling around that. There hasn't been space for that. So in addition to that, I put the positive slant on, we don't necessarily maybe want to know each other's true desires and sexual preferences. And does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think that we've been, and we can talk a little bit about some of the messaging that we've received that kind of leads to some of this discomfort, which is even pro sex messages I think that we do have in Mormonism, which is, that sexuality is normal and it's good and it's of God, which I do think we get those messages often. But it tends to be in this very sacred realm and private realm and secret personal realm. So
Right.
even though we might have that underlying kind of expectation that sex will be a good thing for us and for our marriage, there still is no model to either discuss it, or when things get a little, maybe what we don't particularly think of as sacred, like fantasy, or you mentioned the tongue in somebody's ear, or the messiness of sex, right? Or the fluids involved, or just even the animalistic perspectives of it, I guess is what I would call
Yeah.
that, doesn't mesh with this kind of, sacred, beautiful kind of
Right.
la-di-da unicorn and butterflies model, right? That we have. And so how do you take the more primal, instinctual, take me now type of responses and fit it into that sacred model? I think that's often what makes it difficult. And pornography, I think, definitely falls into that, and why it's
Yeah.
labeled as dirty and degenerate and evil and perverse, when I'm not saying you can't label it those things, and I'm not trying to defend pornography. I think there's definitely problems with pornography, but at the same time, I think what pornography brings out is more of that primal, a curiosity, and body to body, and
Yeah.
that.
Well, and I was thinking about this last night that for many kids growing up in the church, the first conversations they're having about sex are about pornography. The first conversations they're having aren't about normalizing their anatomy, helping understand what's going on with their body, changes in puberty, understanding desire and pleasure. They're not having that. So the first conversation they're having is about pornography, or their first exposure to sexuality is with pornography. And so it feels a big void because we're born sexual beings, and it begins the moment we're born. And so you have kids that are curious, which makes absolute sense. They're noticing things with their body and they don't know where to get those answers. We don't have, even within our church right now, there's a lot of kind of guidelines of, and I'm seeing more and more, but you should make this an ongoing conversation with your kids. You should talk with them about anatomy, and here's a few things, but I haven't seen books that really illustrate anatomy, or do this, so that most kids, their initial exposure to sex isn't it isn't even healthy. But we're assuming that that healthy sexuality just happens, but we're starting at it from kind of a backwards place. We're starting at it. Let's talk to our kids about pornography, which is a starting point. Well, why don't we start and create a video about just healthy sexuality and normalizing that?
Yeah, and I think I've said this before, but most sexual education happens at times when people don't want you to be sexual, right? So
Yes.
as an
Yes.
adolescent, or
When we're
or a
taught.
kid, or a non-married person, and then we kind of stop. We don't really continue sexual education after marriage, or um, and so it's all about the don'ts and the dangers, and it's for the most part primarily fear-based. Again, we do get a
Yes.
little bit of that. It's good at the right time, in the right place, with the right person, but when you're hearing that about 5% of the time, and the rest of the time you're
Yeah,
hearing about the worries and the fears and the risks, which, I mean, obviously there are risks, and sexuality come with a
absolutely.
lot of responsibility, but um, yeah, we do a disservice, I think, in
And
general. And it's not just Mormons who do that. I think in general that's a
no,
trend.
no, there's a lot of research. It's definitely not just Mormons. And I would say you have, when you look at Christianity in general, and again, just American culture, we're not to a place where even comprehensive sex ed is happening. And most people are having a maturation program at best. And that kind of is it. That's what it consists of. And so Yeah, when you were talking about the accessibility of this model, it's out there. There's big channels. There's a lot of support around it. And I empathize with bishops that they're called to help and minister to the people in their wards. And this is the model. This is something it's tangible. They can do it and they can go there, and there's lots of referrals and resources. And so but I'm going to throw this in there now and I brought this up in a different podcast, but that in October of 2015 in the Ensign, Elder Oaks, it's one of the first times I've seen this, and I would love to see more discussion about this. And I had the article pulled up, but here we go. It was October 2015 and titled Recovering from the Trap of Pornography. And it was the first time where he said it's helpful. I'm just going to read this part because I think it's really important. In earlier times and circumstances, our counsel about pornography focused primarily on helping individuals to avoid initial exposure or to recover from an addiction. So right there, he sets up a spectrum and kind of the extremes. While those efforts are still important, past experience and current circumstances have shown the need for counsel addressed to levels of pornography use between the polar extremes of avoidance and addiction. So he introduces nuance. He takes us from binary to maybe there's more to this than we're thinking, which I love. And then he lists kind of 4 things. You have the inadvertent exposure. Yes, that's absolutely going to happen. It's just going to happen. Then you have occasional use. Then you have intensive use. And then compulsive use. He doesn't even put addiction. Number 4 is compulsive use, and then in parentheses, addiction. To me, that is so great. And when you scroll down to read more, he more or less and he goes on to, I won't spend too much more time on it, but the significance of understanding these different levels. And he says in this article that very few people are in the compulsive end of things. Whereas I think before this article, anything, because it's binary, either you're addicted or not, but everyone was compulsive or an addict, and it explained wanting to explore an alternative sex behavior, or it explained having desire or having high libido, or it explained all these things. And now what I hear him saying is, there's more to this than maybe what we were thinking. And I see this as a call there's a lot of room to potentially fill this in and piggyback on it. And I would love to see more discussions stem from this. This is one of those things that I think was slipped into the Ensign, and it didn't get the attention that it deserved.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that that's a very useful resource and like you're saying, a beginning point to start shifting the conversation. And oftentimes it is through our leaders that we are given permission to do that. So that's really, I agree, that's really wonderful.
Yeah.
So to recap, because I'd like to kind of move our conversation more towards, so now what? And since what would you say would be your 3 to 5 bullet points as to why you feel like the sexual addiction model is not beneficial or not what you would choose to work from? And then we can work, we can talk about how we would want to work around some of these issues.
Okay. So the bullet point of why I don't think it's the appropriate model is the idea of once an addict, always an addict. That I don't see where this transitions into healthy sexuality. That you're in recovery, using the term sober, that I'm not sure what that really looks like and what that means to be sober. And the next thing is that it pathologizes a lot of sexuality. That, again, we're kind of judging and deeming what's okay and what's not, and it's particularly around behavior. And it's very a heterosexual model, and it focuses mostly on men. And so there's a lot of reasons that I see it not being the best possible model to address what people are obviously wanting help about and wanting to understand. So it's not to discount people's distress, people's need for answers. And so this transitions into, okay, we're acknowledging this distress. We're acknowledging the need that people need help. We're acknowledging that people want to do something. So what? So how do you help?
Great. Okay, so let's start with, I know you've mentioned this word before, sex
Okay.
positive positions. What does
Yes.
that mean? What does it mean when you say I take a sex positive position or I'm a sex positive therapist wanting to address these types of issues?
I'm looking at it more from a sense of overall health. Where do you feel you're healthiest emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually? I'm putting sexuality in that mix because oftentimes we see it split off from healthy. So, for example, uh, I right now don't feel healthiest if I were to eat two bowls of ice cream a day. That's not where I feel healthiest. Um, so if I were to translate that over to relationship, if I'm going to bed and getting on my iPod every single night and not connecting with my partner, my relationship doesn't feel its healthiest. So sex positivity is looking at it that sexuality is an important and necessary and lovely part of who we are as individuals, and it's so much more than just a behavior. It's more than just something we do, but who we are. That it is a very core piece of who we are, and that versus labeling and seeing all these different behaviors as toxic and celebrating sexual diversity and yada yada yada.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's a great place to start.
Okay.
And I think you kind of touched on this before, but um, there are reasons other than addiction as to why oftentimes we don't live our healthiest lives. And sometimes they are diagnosable reasons, and sometimes they're just having to tweak certain aspects of behavior. I mean, all of us are on a trajectory or spectrum, right, of trying to progress and trying to lead the quality of life that we would hope to have. So let's revisit some of these diagnosable issues anyway that sometimes and often come up. I think it was
Okay.
when you were talking about, the couple that you originally talked about, that there were some underlying issues there, that the pornography usage in a sense was a symptom of something underlying that
Yes.
wasn't being addressed. And oftentimes that's one of my biggest concerns with the sex addiction model, is that you're focusing on the behavior and not really addressing what's really at the core issue of why this person feels empty or
Right.
unsatisfied, or is needing coping mechanisms, to just kind of survive.
Right.
And then that's being misinterpreted by the spouse as, you don't prioritize our relationship, you don't love me, you don't find me attractive, all those super
Yeah.
negative messages, that can be very harmful for the spouse as well.
Right. No, I think you said that very
Yeah,
well. I think the underlying issues, and research does support that sex is oftentimes a symptom that, and this happens with therapy in general. People come in wanting one thing in particular treated or addressed, and as they unwrap and pull back the layers, they find that it's something else. And so, as you pull back and put people in context and put people in their overall lifespan development and attachment histories and all of these different things, uh, a lot of what's going on currently can make a lot of sense, and to realize the role that pornography or the different sex they're seeking out, it makes sense. And so when you start to bring awareness to that for people, and you start maybe for the first time, they're realizing they've had untreated depression or anxiety or OCD, and you can start to address that. And for some people, they really may need more than than once a week counseling to address this, that they need some support in managing the symptoms and or the behavior, but it still doesn't mean I have to label them as an addict to do that. There's times when with mental health in general that it warrants more intensive treatment and help, and other times where it's less so, but I don't have to give them the title of addict and then all of a sudden move it into an entirely different behavioral model.
Okay. So how do we go about then measuring success? So if somebody, you had mentioned before that one of the positives of the sex addiction models that, you have a clear definition, you have, which a lot of people fall into, you have a treatment plan, and then you have positive outcomes. I don't know necessarily what you meant by positive outcomes, because my experience actually with a lot of the sex addiction model people who've gone through those types of treatments is that then they come to me after that and say, you know what, I didn't really sense a difference, or I lied through it, which is oftentimes one of the kind of markers of shame and secrecy and sexuality anyway.
Sure.
It's just, being dishonest about what you're doing because there's so much anxiety. I don't want to lose my marriage. I don't want to disappoint the therapist. I don't want to, I want this to be successful. So a lot of people just kind of find themselves in a lot of that same,
Well, so
yeah,
to
go ahead.
speak to the positive outcomes, because I've worked with a lot of clients where I think the positive outcome for a lot of people is the term sobriety, that they're no longer doing the behavior in what was being seen as causing the problem or the distress for the individual and or the relationship. So they get to that point where they've cut out that behavior. So that's what they're identifying as positive.
And how often does that actually come to
That's
fruition?
actually happened, because I have people that have been in these 12-step programs. They're 5 years in, and they'll say, I'm 5 years sober. And for them, that's a success. And then they come to me and they're like, okay, but our relationship, we're still not connecting. I still don't feel like I have a grip on understanding my sexuality. I'm still now dependent on my partner having sex with me to manage all of this that's going on. And that's where then I help them transition from that way of thinking about sexuality and looking at it differently, and helping them have room to understand their sexuality individually. Because that's also a challenge, is most people come into a relationship and they don't even understand their own sexuality, let alone now having to understand their partner's sexuality and relational sexuality. So I help people pick this apart and look at it and start to explore and examine and question and talk about things in ways that they haven't done. Because yeah, you can cut out a behavior, but then what? You have a hole. And so people come and they're like, how do we feel connected now? I don't like feeling like the dutiful wife. I don't like feeling like my anxiety is if I don't have sex with him, like if I don't feel it one night, and that he's going to quote unquote relapse. This isn't working for us, and it's killing the pleasure or the desire, and we don't want that anymore. And so when I say success, I'm seeing sobriety, but really in the big picture, I don't deem that as success, but I go off of clients that say, I'm proud of this part, but I'm not, I've stopped that behavior, but I'm left having my hands held up of, I don't really know where to go from here. I don't know what to do. And our relationship is we're still having a lot of struggles in the sexual realm.
Yeah, and I would second all of that. I think the only thing I would add to that is that in my experience, the sobriety piece has not been the majority of the people I've worked with.
Right.
So in other words, there's usually been a reduction of the behavior.
Sure.
And
Yep.
again, there's that lack
Yep.
of celebrating spectrum success, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
if it's happened once, we still are going to feel as awful about it as if it was happening 5 times or 10, 100 times, So so I think that one of the issues for me is that success is then measured on very rigid terms, with sobriety. Like it has
Yes.
to be 100% compliance
Yes.
versus seeing this as something that we're going to improve upon, and maybe unwanted behaviors will reduce, but wanted behaviors and all that you're mentioning, right? Like now we're going to maybe look at things deeper and explore things we don't know how to explore, and that's scary in of itself and brings up all different kinds of anxieties. And so
Yeah.
I definitely see that as part of successful outcomes versus what maybe people have been taught to think are successful outcomes, which to your point is 100%
Yes.
compliance.
Exactly. And that I very much I see this a lot with my clients where they'll come in and success for them is going to actually, if they're single, um, they'll say, I just want to turn off. And actually, even married, they'll deem that their desire is too high, that they want sex too much. And so they just want to turn it off. And I can't tell you how many, and it's mostly men that say this, say, if you could just prescribe me a pill to shut off my desire, I would prefer that. And I often have to say, this again, this is a soul source. And if you cut off your desire, you're cutting off your creativity, you're cutting off drive and motivation and all these other factors that are the source of this healthy sexuality. And so for some people, also connecting sex and spirituality, and that there's room for that. And I have a therapeutic model that I really like that helps people deconstruct where they feel they're healthiest, because again, their goal will be total abstinence. I know I will be successful once I'm not thinking about this as much, or I'm not acting it out. And as we continue to challenge and grapple with it, what people will find is I actually don't feel my healthiest when I've totally cut off my sexuality either. So what do I do with that? And that's part of the work. Either way, people are having to do work, and so it's kind of figuring out what kind of work do I want to be engaged in. And I personally come from the place of giving people space to grapple with their sexuality, take ownership over it, to not have someone else take ownership, because then they're not, we all know, as if we don't decide for ourselves we want to do something, it's far harder than standing on our own 2 feet and coming to terms with having our sexuality be in line with our morals, our values, our integrity. And for some people, they have those quick answers of, because we're trained. But then when they really stop and look at it and have an opportunity, they're like, maybe I don't value that as much as I thought, as evidenced by these different aspects. Or maybe I am okay with this piece and I haven't even had room to think about that. And I have a lot of clients that I'll check in with them and I'll say, how are you doing? And they're like, I'm feeling like I'm really making progress, and it's not in the way that I assumed. And I feel happy and I feel healthy, and I'm not scared anymore. I'm not walking around white knuckling, because I have a sense of ownership over my sexuality. I have deeper understanding of who I am and where I begin and end. And that's where people start to feel a lot more secure in their sexuality, and in their relationship they feel more secure, that they're not just kind of a ticking time bomb, and that they could all of a sudden, quote unquote, relapse it under just the right circumstances. And so to free up the way that we're looking at it beyond just relapse, sobriety, addiction, etc.
Are you comfortable sharing some of this model that you mentioned as far as how you work with people?
Yeah, I would love to, because I've seen it. I love it. I was trained by Dr. Gina Ogden, and you can look her up and you can go to her website, called Expanding the Practice of Sex Therapy. And really what we're doing is it's a holistic model for looking at sexuality. And she has developed a model that's more experiential. So we're not just, I'm not just talking with people about their sexuality on a couch, because as we know, sex isn't just an experience in our head. It's a full body experience. We're having physical sensations, emotional sensations. We're having thoughts around it, and then how it relates to religion and spirituality. And so Gina's done a really good job of giving it a way to pick apart and examine our sexuality and explore it differently, and to be curious and develop insights and understanding. So really what this model does is I'll give a quick example. I have clients that want to have more of an experiential and a four-dimensional way of exploring their sexuality. And so I will ask them, I'm like, all right, what I want you to do is I'm going to ask you to find 2 objects between now and the next time we meet. I want you to find one object that represents a part of your sexual story that you would like to let go of. And so they may find keys, they may find, it can be any single object that you attach meaning to that symbolizes a part of your sexual story that you don't like, such as, let's say, a leash. And someone's like, this is a part of my story. I feel bound and I feel trapped and I feel stuck. And so that's what this represents. And then they bring in another object that represents an aspect of their sexual story that they would like to feel more of or experience more of or expand on. That's another object that they attach meaning to. And I've had people bring in books where it's exploring more of the intimate side of a relationship. I've had people bring in a variety of objects. And then what we do is we explore these different things physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And again, you can learn more about this model. But what time and time and time again, people, as they are moving their bodies and they're engaging in their exploring their sexuality more holistically and multidimensionally, people leave saying, I don't have answers right now, but I have so much more clarity. I've got many more places to explore and understand, and it deepens it. And I do this, and I've done this with individuals and couples, and it changes things for people. And as people sit in the spiritual quadrant, for many, they're like, I don't even know where to begin integrating sex and spirituality into my life. In fact, I don't even know what spirituality is. I can talk about religion. And so even to be able to, how do I integrate sex and spirituality? For many people, they see those as 2 separate things that I couldn't even begin to talk to God about sexuality. I couldn't even, these things don't go together. And it's beautiful and powerful to watch people start to reclaim their sexuality and restore something that was God-given at birth, and to restore it into a place that is theirs, and it's integrated, and they feel clarity and they feel healthy.
That's wonderful. I love all of that. I think that's so important. And probably the thing I'd like to end on is this idea that you mentioned of maybe not walking away from a therapy session with everything figured out, and that sexuality in general is not, there's not an end destination, that it's a continual process, and that regardless of your age or situation, there's always something more that you can explore, something more that you can experience, and some reframing that can be done to help move towards those healthier spaces. So I really appreciate your input on all of that. So as we close up, let me just ask you 2 things. One is tell us about any projects or things that you're involved with. I think we talked briefly before we got on about the Mormon Porn Project, which I'd like for you to spend some time on, and then just share with us some closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us on this topic, and we'll go from there.
Okay, and I'll make these into bullet points. My sister and I, Alicia Worthington, we're going to be launching a new website called Sex Made Simple, and the tagline is education at your fingertips, so that people can start to get the sex ed that they have wanted, or ask questions, but in an anonymous way, or where it's more convenient, or a variety of things. So that should be launching in the next couple of weeks. And then the other thing that I'm involved in, which is the Mormon Porn Project, and I've been working with Gina with this, and we're just getting ready to be able to pilot the questionnaire and survey, but it more or less is giving men room to explore their experience and their history with pornography, and to share their story, quite frankly, in a non-judgmental way, and to explore it and have room to not have to judge it. to say, yeah, I'm involved with pornography and it's horrible and I wish I could quit, to go, well, there must have been a positive side, and let's free up the judgment and just explore this for you. So again, you can have clarity and more insight, and then decide where do you want to go from there. So that should be launching soon once we just get more of the survey questions honed, and I'm really excited about that. I think those are my most current projects. There's always things coming down the pipeline, as you know, Natasha. But
Yeah,
those
no,
two
and I'll
most
definitely
current.
link to anything you want me to link to as well.
Thank you.
All right, so closing thoughts on this whole topic.
Closing thoughts is, I understand and empathize people that are currently experiencing distress, that they're confused, they're hurt, all the emotional aspects, and the crisis and tailspin that can put people both personally and in their relationship. And to consider potentially looking at this in a different way, and or just beginning the pursuit of getting more information and education, because I think that is so empowering. And so those would be my closing thoughts.
Thank you. I can't thank you enough for spending your time with me today. It's been very valuable, and I think just this is a very important topic that I plan on having several guests on, both professionals and even hopefully some personal stories if people are comfortable sharing that. Because it plays such a big role, I think, in the current discussion that's happening within Mormonism and in the interplay between sexuality and our religious beliefs and our values and our morals. And it's a complicated topic, and lots of different experiences to explore. So thank you for being my first interviewee.
Thank you for having me. I loved it. I could talk about this with you for hours, so this was a pleasure.
Thank you, Kristin.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.